It is, I think, that we are all so alone in what lies deepest in our souls, so unable to find the words and perhaps the courage to speak with unlocked hearts, that we don't know at all that it is the same with others.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 5, Episode 51, The Man Who Received a Severe Mercy, After Hours with Will Vaus. Well, good morning, everyone, or good evening, whenever you're listening to Pints with Jack. This is, of course, your favorite weekly C.S. Lewis podcast, where together with David and Matt, we break down and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis. After finishing our season-long look at the Four Loves, we enjoyed Ecumenism Month, Apologetics Month, and for the past few weeks, we've had a Severe Mercy Month, where Matt and I read and discussed that famous book by Sheldon Vanauken. And today, we wrap up the series by speaking to a man who wrote the biography of Sheldon Vanauken, Pastor Will Vaus. Let me give you a little information about Will. He was born in Sleepy Hollow, New York, grew up in La Jolla, California, and he and his wife Becky have been married since 1988 and have 3 grown sons. His own father was Jim Vaus, former organized crime wiretapper who came to personal faith in Jesus Christ through the ministry of Billy Graham in 1949. And Will, I bet we could probably have a whole episode just on your dad.
We could.
He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Drama from the University of California, San Diego, a fellow UC grad, and has a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary, where I hear the buildings look like they're from Oxford. He served in churches across the United States and is currently the pastor of First Congregational Church of Yarmouth on Cape Cod. He's the president of Will Vaus Ministries and the author of 14 books, including Mere Theology, A Guide to the Thought of C.S. Lewis, and the book we'll be discussing today, The Man Who Received a Severe Mercy. Will Vaus, welcome finally to Pints with Jack.
It's great to be with you at last.
Yes, so happy to have you join us, and grateful that we have the excuse. Now, you just had a wedding anniversary, is that right?
I did. It was our 34th wedding anniversary, but it's funny. We always think about like the year we're going into, so we're starting our 35th year. And I had mentioned that like the night before, and my wife got confused the next day, and she posted on Facebook that we were celebrating our 35th anniversary. So
okay.
It's hard to keep track after a while.
Now, I was told there'd be no math in seminary, and they lied to me. And so going into your 35th year...
Oh, you must have gone to the wrong seminary then. That was very important to me that there be no math.
Yeah, absolutely. I once went to a marriage conference with my wife, some speakers who were friends of hers, and we sat with this couple beforehand, and she said, "Oh, we've been married for 45 years, but it only feels like 45 minutes underwater." Suffice it to say,
not good.
Yeah, no, we didn't ask them for any marriage advice. So
I guess not.
Yeah, but what's your marriage advice? I mean, you wrote a book about a man with an incredible marriage who is influenced by another man with an incredible marriage, and it sounds like you've enjoyed a great season with Becky. Any thoughts as we conclude the Four Loves year?
Oh, I think the most important thing is commitment. That's what I tell couples whose weddings I officiate, if they ask me. Mm-hmm. I find a lot of couples today very uncurious, They don't have great curiosity, and many are not asking questions or seeking advice. But when they do, that's always a good sign, I think, that they want to learn from others. But so if they do ask, I say, I think commitment is number one, just being committed to each other no matter what.
How does that make its way evident in the day-to-day for you all?
Oh, in the day-to-day, that you just, that giving up is not an option, that you're going to work through things when you feel fit to be tied, angry or frustrated or empty in some way, or when you get to those patches in marriage where it just isn't what you expected it was going to be, or isn't as fulfilling as you thought it was going to be, you work your way through it.
Oh, that's great. I can't wait to hear more. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about, I read Severe Mercy long before I was married. And so I think it colored some of my ideas. I'd love to hear what Severe Mercy did for you in your marriage as we dig into the book. But before we do, I wonder if you had a chance to get something to drink.
I do have something to drink. I'm drinking Perrier.
Okay, not gin or what was it, gin or bourbon? Is that what Vanauken offered you?
Yes, I think he offered me gin, and I said, I don't drink gin. But actually, before I could get the words out, he looked at me with this sort of feigned look of horror coming across his face, and he said, "You're not a teetotaler, are you?"
You settled on sherry, right?
I said, "No, I just don't drink gin."
Yeah.
I like your cup there, your Magdalen College mug.
Yes. And about a month from right now, as we're recording it, actually, listeners, we're recording it on week 3 of Severe Mercy Month. And so we're recording it on the Tuesday where Matt and I wrapped up our third of 3 weeks of looking at the episode. But a month from now, I'll be in England with Northwind Seminary. We'll be doing our Oxford pilgrimage. And then I'll go on to the Oxbridge Conference. And
wonderful.
Going to have a chance. Do you know Simon Horobin? Have you encountered him yet?
I do not.
A Magdalen English professor who's working on Lewis's annotations of literary works. And so Walter introduced us, and so he's invited me to spend some time with him, and I think I'll even get to go sit in hall and have dinner at Magdalen. So looking forward to going back.
Well, those annotations are in some of his books, as you know, very, very elaborate, very detailed, and takes some time to get on to his handwriting. But after you've done that, it's quite a lot of fun to look at his library books.
Certainly is. Charlie Starr has made a cottage industry of that. And
yes,
his whole study of the way that the F in C.S. Lewis's handwriting changes significantly. So I call him the effing C.S. Lewis handwriting expert. That's probably not the right thing to do. Well, so we're toasting our Patreon supporters. I'm going to toast all of those Patreon supporters who will be joining us in in about a month when we have a special event with Dr. Michael Ward. So to our Patreon supporters, especially those who will join us in England, cheers.
Cheers.
Well, we did a little introduction to about your life, but I would love to hear more. I'm sure that just scraped the surface. You've written so many books about Lewis, and I'd love to hear about your life and ministry. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, gosh, where do you want to start? You talked about where I was born and grew up, and I guess the most important thing, going back to the beginning of my life that connects to our conversation today, is that I became an Anglophile at a young age, and I didn't even know what that was. I fell in love with England as a little tiny boy looking at my parents' slides of a trip that they had taken to London. And in addition to that, we had in the 1960s a Time Life Atlas that had these huge, you have to imagine yourself back into a time when very few books had color photographs, but this Time Life Atlas had color photographs of different places around the world. And the only pictures I was interested in were the ones of London and of England. And so that happened long before I encountered C.S. Lewis or Sheldon Vanauken. And so there was something in me that was drawing me to all things English.
Oh, fantastic. Did you have an English connection at all with some of your reading as a child?
Oh, just sort of the standard things. My parents weren't really great readers, so I didn't grow up in a house full of books like C.S. Lewis did. My introduction to fantasy stories was through this series of Walt Disney Golden books, which were these thick editions, not like the little thin golden books you think of.
Yeah.
And one of them had this yellow spine, and it was stories from other lands. And that was my favorite one. I really didn't care about the other three in the series. And my absolute favorite story in that collection was Mary Poppins. I don't think I had even seen the film. I don't remember going to many movies as a child. And I just asked my mother to read that story to me over and over again.
Oh, that's fantastic.
So there was again something, even through that sort of distorted lens of Walt Disney, that called out to me from England.
Yeah, it's when I think of Lewis looking at the mountains of Mourne and getting those stirrings that later, grew into fruition for him. Those early influences, I think, stick with us. So
absolutely.
Well, how did you first encounter C.S. Lewis? What was your first kind of coming across him?
So I was in 4th grade, public school, Southern California. My teacher read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to our class. And I was enchanted. I fell in love with Narnia. I think part of it at first was that here I was, a little boy who had grown up in New York, and my parents had moved me to Southern California, and I missed white Christmases, and so just the enchantment of walking through a wardrobe door into that winter wonderland, that's what caught me. I just fell in love with that picture, as I think C.S. Lewis did. It never occurred to me until years later. I mean, obviously, it was always winter in Narnia because of this spell from this wicked witch. But the beauty of that winter wonderland is what came across to me and just drew me right in. And then, when she got to the end of the book, she must have told us, that this was the first book in a series of 7. And that was the only time that I ever went home and told my parents, you have to buy me these books.
Oh, wow.
And I had, other than the Walt Disney Golden Book I was telling you about, I'd never read any fantasy. And I just knew I had to have more of Narnia. And so my parents went, and I was a very slow reader. I still am. My parents went out and bought me the set, the paperback box set in 1972.
Okay.
And I just started making my way slowly through those books. And for me at that time, it's funny what happens in your childish brain. Here I was sitting in a classroom of kids, hearing our teacher read this, but I felt like it was just for me. I never talked with the teacher about it. I never talked with the other children about it. And, I felt in my heart of hearts that C.S. Lewis had created this just for me. So I can remember a year or two later seeing another child in my class reading one of the Narnia books, during individual reading time in school. And I'm sure I didn't say anything to her, but my internal reaction was, how dare you read?
Wow.
It's like my own private world. So I had no idea that it never occurred to me, that C.S. Lewis was this famous writer and that millions of people around the world were reading Narnia.
So you had kind of the opposite of the "what you do" reaction, when Lewis and Arthur.
That didn't come until later.
Okay.
Much, much later for me.
Okay. So you read all the Chronicles. How old were you?
So 4th grade, I was 9 years old, when I got introduced to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I don't remember exactly how long it took me before I got through all of the books. I would say by the time I was in junior high school, so over about a 2 to 3 year period, I read all 7.
Okay. Were you raised in faith? Did you have?
I was, but I made no mental connection whatsoever between C.S. Lewis and Christianity or Narnia and the Bible. I don't think it ever occurred to me when I was reading them as a child. And now it's, looking at it as an adult, it's hard to imagine how that could be, how I didn't see that.
Yeah. Well, and of course, Lewis talks about that. And I think in Letters to Children that often children will make the connections and the parents will miss them. I was raised in no faith and read them about the same time. I think I was 8 or 9. And just swallowed them whole, loved the adventure stories, but had no faith context. But even if I had, I'm not sure that I would necessarily have made the connection. But I remember to this day the kind of untarnished nobility of Peter really stirring something in me, and I now see that that's maybe some form or aspect of righteousness or holiness that I was attracted to. But this kind of, he felt like a hero who was human, right? But also somebody that I could really put, trust my heart to or something. I wouldn't have thought about it in those terms, but just, I think Lewis touched on these things that I think were very stirring. Did you return to them later, the Narnias?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Through, so I was raised in a Christian home, but during those years we're talking about, when I was reading the Narnia stories, my parents didn't go to church anywhere. So I was sort of like you would have been in that sense, in that I wasn't connected to a church at that time. And so that didn't happen for me until about 8th grade. And a kid who lived down the street from me, who had been my enemy, by the way, would follow me home from school if he had a friend to protect him. Follow me home from school, pitching rocks at me and calling me names. Oh, wow. And somehow we went from that to becoming friends.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know whether our parents knew each other or what it was. Anyway, he ended up inviting me to youth group. It never occurred to me to ask in my own mind, why is somebody who's a Christian treating me like that? Because I was just glad he had gone from being my enemy to being my friend. And he invited me to come to youth group, and I turned him down flat. I was just not interested in that. And my mother heard about that, and she thought it'd be good for me to go to youth group. And she persuaded me. And so the next time he invited me, I went. And it was the first youth group meeting that this very large Presbyterian church in La Jolla, California, had a new youth pastor. His name was Sonny Salisbury, and he was a huge C.S. Lewis fan.
Oh, okay.
And I don't remember whether that came across the first night, but eventually I learned that about him. And he was just friendly. He played guitar. He sang songs. He told stories. And I was hooked. And I just kept going to youth group after that. And eventually I heard him talk about C.S. Lewis, and whether I had made the connection between Lewis and Christianity by that time, he definitely made it for me. I think it was one of those sort of gradual things, like, I hope it's safe to say this on an adult podcast, right? Like as a kid, when you suddenly realize that Santa Claus, is not really actually there at the North Pole. It sort of dawns on you. Yeah. For some of us, it dawns on us gradually. Like, I can't remember when that suddenly occurred to me. It was the same way about discovering the connection between Narnia and Christian faith, between Aslan and Christ. And yeah.
Well, and once we get on to Lewis, it's hard to shut us up, isn't it?
That's right.
I don't know if your congregants play the drinking game of, every time you mention Lewis in a sermon.
They would love it.
Or no, it's just all of my friends. In fact, it's kind of like on the podcast. Whenever I mention Till We Have Faces, Matt and David take a drink because I've been working on that book. But with everybody else at large, like in seminary class, anytime I raised my hand, my classmates would mutter, "Oh, C.S. Lewis."
Yeah. I do get a bit of that.
But if that's simply, in my opinion, just because he's so eloquent on so many of the important things. So
that's right.
So, well, that and that affection for him has led you to write a number of books. We're talking about, of course, your biography of Vanauken, which is maybe a secondary relic when it comes to Lewis. But tell us about some of your other books about Lewis. I saw that didn't you post on social media the other day that Amazon recommended a book for you?
Yeah, that's happened more than once where Amazon recommends one of my books to me. You would think somehow in their computer system they'd be able to recognize, oh, we're recommending a book by this author, and it's match the names up, but
the algorithm is true.
Yeah. So so I got into writing about Lewis. I sort of backed into it in a way. I was living in South Carolina at the time. I was pastoring a church, and I got invited. I was pastoring a Presbyterian church, but I got invited by the Anglican Society of South Carolina to deliver a Lenten lecture. And they knew I had they wanted it to be connected to Lewis somehow, because they knew I had that interest. I had started a Lewis reading group. And so I did that. And I did my talk on something that was very interesting to me as a Presbyterian, Lewis's take on predestination, and free will, and how those things fit together. So I put that lecture together, and then I thought, oh, that was fun. And I got some good feedback on it. And I thought, it'd be fun to get this published. And so I sent it off to the New York C.S. Lewis Society, and I was really thrilled that they wanted to publish it. And then after that, I thought, oh, maybe I'll do this again. So then I picked a different theological topic, Lewis on Scripture, another one that really fascinated me. What was his take on the authority of Scripture? And so I did that. And again, the New York C.S. Lewis Society published it. And then I thought, I could do this on a whole bunch of theological topics, and did some research and found out there was really only one published book at that time on Lewis's theology by John Randolph Willis, a Jesuit. And it didn't really look at all of Lewis's theology. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of be as expansive as possible. So that's where my book, Mere Theology, came from, was just one by one, looking at those different theological topics, spiritual themes in Lewis. And I kind of started with a traditional list of theological loci, and then I added some different Lewisian themes like love, the four loves. And it went from there.
And then you did In the Footsteps of Lewis?
Yes, that's another one of my books that came about in an interesting way. So once I was a published author on Lewis, as you've experienced, you get invitations to speak in different places. And I was actually at Wheaton at the Waite Center doing a talk about another one of my Lewis books called Speaking About Jack, which is a discussion guide to all of Lewis's books. And I also had some of my own personal photograph books there from trips I'd taken to Oxford. And during the sort of mixing fellowship time after the talk I gave, there was a woman standing there, and she was looking at one of my personal photograph books, and she said, "How much is this?" And I said, "Oh, I'm not selling it. It's just my, I thought people might have fun looking at it." And so that planted in me the idea that, oh, maybe I should, put together some of my own pictures from various trips, and tie it into to Lewis's biography and put a little picture book together. So that's where In the Footsteps of C.S. Lewis, which Amazon recommended to me,
Good. That's an excellent use of their algorithm. Yeah. Well, and I love there actually are surprisingly few of those picture books. I think Through Joy and Beyond, Walter's
was the first one. Yeah.
Yeah, and then images of his world.
Right. Which that's my favorite, and it's such a wonderful book. By Clyde Kilby and Douglas Gilbert.
Right.
I think that book may have been my first introduction to any sort of biography of Lewis.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Was reading that. And my original version of it was paperback. So I probably, I don't know, sometime in the late 70s was when I came across that.
That long, skinny one. They've since updated it and have a nice, snazzy green cover. And then
I have each version of it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And then Hal and Rebecca Poe did the Inklings of Oxford.
Yes, that's a lovely book.
So,
and there's a few others you haven't mentioned, but there's a number of them on the market.
The Irish one is the Sandy Smith one is great, and I about to put one of those on my eBay shelf. So, well, tell me a little bit about Sheldon Vanauken. We've talked. Matt and I have gone through the book. We took 3 different weeks to kind of make our way through the book with our observations about Vanauken. Love to hear a little bit about the biography, how you came about it, how you researched it, a little bit about I don't want to spoil too much, but you had some encounters with Vanauken. And I'd love to spend the balance of our time kind of thinking about that book. And once again, you can get it from Winged Lion Press. Listeners, of course, will have a link. It's I wish I could, I always show pictures to the microphone for our podcast, and that doesn't help folks much. But I was very struck by all the pictures and the detail of the research. I think it's a great addition. It's kind of, I have a whole section in my library called C.S. Lewis and, right? Lewis and philosophy, Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, Lewis and this and that. And it fills a needed hole because Vanauken, well, tell us more.
Yes, and I wish that they were color pictures in my Vanauken book. In the Footsteps book is full color, but it results in a more expensive book, and it would have made the Vanauken book just too expensive for most people. But I wish it could be that way. Anyway, so let me take you back to where I encountered his book, A Severe Mercy. So I mentioned my youth pastor growing up. So I really got involved in the youth group at La Jolla Presbyterian Church. And then I started going on Sunday mornings. And then our youth pastor also had a teen choir. He was a professional musician. And the big thing every year was to get to go on the teen choir tour. And one year we went up and down the West Coast performing in churches and other venues. And every year we'd be performing a different set of music, a musical or various things. But to be able to go on that, you had to do some reading outside of the Bible. And he would recommend, Christian books to read, not only before the trip, but then he would carry around a cardboard box filled with paperback books, and he'd pass it around the bus, and you had to pick out a book you were going to read, So I reached into this cardboard box, and I actually pulled out 2 books, 2 paperbacks. One was A Grief Observed, which was new to me at that point. And the other was A Severe Mercy. And what attracted me was not the topic. I mean, here I was, that may have been the summer after I graduated from high school. I had gone through very little loss in my life. There's no reason why A Grief Observed and A Severe Mercy should have appealed to me, except it was the C.S. Lewis connection. And I figured anybody who'd written Narnia, anything he had to say had to be valuable and would eventually be meaningful to me. So that's what attracted me to both books, because the paperback copy, which I have here and is falling apart, and like you said, it doesn't make sense to show this to the microphone.
The little yellow one,
Yeah, it says, includes 18 previously unpublished letters by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And Lewis's name is in bigger, bolder type than Vanauken's name. And that's what attracted me.
Same.
So then I started into reading it on that trip, and I did not make it very far. The first chapter, Glenn Merrill Revisited, where he recounts going back to his childhood home and sort of the ghost of his dead wife being there in the air. It just bored me to tears. It just, like I said, I was a very slow reader and still am. And something would like have to grab me, like from the first sentence or the first couple paragraphs. And it just, I felt like it was a slog. And so I put the book down, and I didn't pick it up again for quite some time, but I didn't throw it out either. I kept a hold of it. And so sometime between that time, that was 1981, and the next year, after I'd gone through a year of college, the following year, I went on a sort of personal pilgrimage to the British Isles and traveled around all by myself, reading all the C.S. Lewis books I hadn't read up to that point in time. But I know I had finished Severe Mercy by that time, because so many of the images in the 2 Oxford chapters kind of prepared me for what I was going to see in Oxford.
Yeah.
And the story of Christians never say goodbye.
Yes.
In fact, on my time in Oxford, I found myself on a Sunday evening standing on the high street opposite the Eastgate Hotel, and it suddenly hit me, oh, I'm standing in the spot where C.S. Lewis would have stood when he turned around and boomed across the street, Christians never say goodbye.
Never say goodbye. I've got a bone to pick with Jack about that, because goodbye is the contraction for God be with ye. So, if he were around, I'd fight with him. But yeah,
You're so technical.
Well, yeah, English teacher. But that experience too, when I finally got to Oxford, I felt like I could navigate the place without having to look around much, just because I had read so much about it. I remember visiting Marge Mead in her office at the Wade Center, and she has that poster, the aerial view of Oxford.
Yes.
And, I could trace the high street down to Magdalen, and where there's the Eastgate, and there's and yeah, I felt like I could navigate, and it gave me chills being there. And the first month after being in Oxford, I think I dreamt about it every week, and maybe every month for the first year. But Vanauken was a huge piece of that, because I think he captures it so well. So
yes, he captured it in words and images of his world by Clyde Kilby and Douglas Gilbert. That gave me the only technical information I had to guide me to any places. And at that time in 1982, C.S. Lewis was not much remembered or talked about in Oxford. You may remember that coincidentally was the year that the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society started there. But I was there in the summer. I didn't know anything about that starting. There just weren't many people who remembered or talked about Lewis there at that time. There weren't any guides published or anything like that. I sort of had to find my way.
The cottage industry hadn't, I think, quite become the evangelical patron saint
right
at that point. Well, tell us about meeting Vanauken and that encounter and kind of what you learned about Lewis from being with him.
Yes. So even though I had such a rough start with A Severe Mercy, once I read through the book, I fell in love with, again, just like I fell in love with Narnia, there were several aspects of Severe Mercy that just drew me in. Like you were mentioning about yourself. So I was a young man reading this, 18, 19 years old. I was very idealistic. I was a romantic with a capital R. I loved the romantic poets. And so the poetry drew me in once I got to those parts. The just full-on romantic relationship between Van and Davy, as he describes it, I thought, this is everything I would want, in a spouse, in a lover. And So that drew me in, but even more the Oxford chapters. And when I read it, I hadn't even been to Oxford, but just the picture that he painted and the spiritual questions that he was asking were very much my questions. Though again, I'd grown up in the church, had a time where I wasn't involved in church, and then got involved in youth group and all of that. I still had questions, intellectual questions about, could I, emotionally, I had received Jesus, but I still had questions about, can I really go on believing that he is the Son of God, like I've been taught? Is he fully God, fully man? What? And how do I know what the Gospels say is true? And all these same kind of questions that Vanauken wrestled with in different ways. And so that was the biggest appeal to me in the book. And then I found the chapters on his grief when he loses Davy just hauntingly beautiful.
Yeah. Now, he wrote this book fairly quickly, didn't he?
He did. Over a summer, really, but he spent a good amount of time editing. He actually tells us that he wrote each chapter 3 times, which I think means, he was doing it on a typewriter.
Right.
And so I think that means that he wrote out each chapter on the typewriter one time, and then he looked it over, and then he'd write it out again, and then a third time. The only place where he did more was with that first chapter, Glenn Merrill Revisited. He says he wrote that 14 times.
Oh, my goodness.
All of it I find kind of amazing, because I don't know about you, but as a writer, I'm working on a computer, I lose track of the number of times that I'm working on a book right now. I'm already up to 8 versions of it, So,
well, and our friend Tolkien with his 12 volumes of false starts to the Lord
of
the Rings.
Yeah, absolutely.
And our mutual friend Diana Glyer talks about, I think 8 or 9 drafts is not bad for her as a teacher of writing.
Right, right.
To kind of find your way.
So I fell in love with the book for multiple reasons, and then it became one of those books I loved so much I kept going back to it and reading it again and again. And then when I was at seminary, at Princeton Seminary, I was part of a student group, and we would have speakers come in, and I decided to write to Sheldon Vanauken and see if he would come and address our group. And he wrote back a very polite little postcard and said, no. He said, I'm a writer, not a speaker, but if you ever come to the South, look me up. And I thought that was nice, but I amazingly didn't really think any more of it for about 10 years. And then I found myself living in the South. My family had moved.
South Carolina, right?
Yeah, I was in South Carolina. He was in Virginia, but my family had moved to Virginia. So I had reason to be in that area. And I had just recently started a C.S. Lewis Society in South Carolina. I had this sort of Renaissance experience of returning to all things Lewis. And I thought, I wonder if he's still around. And so I wrote to him. I had saved the postcard.
Yeah.
So I found it and wrote to that address, and he wrote back. And that led to the first of 2 meetings face to face.
Oh, that's great. And listeners, a lot of this is detailed in the book, and it's a fetching read. It's such a gift to have, because I don't think many people really invested in him. Lots of people have gotten to know Walter Hooper over the years, but I regret that I was in Lynchburg once when I was traveling with Phil Keggy and hadn't made the connection. When did Vanauken die?
In 1996.
Okay, so he would have still been around in 92 or something when I was there.
Right.
I wish that I had the chance to.
He was very open and welcoming of people who wanted to meet him, and he looked at that as a ministry. He called it his postcard ministry, because most people that he wrote back to, fans who would write to him. He would initially write back with a postcard. And then if the correspondence ensued and got really interesting, then you'd start to get more detailed letters from him.
You know, I think I don't know why I've thought so much about Walter Hooper when thinking about Vanauken and your relationship with him.
Well, they knew each other.
Right. That Norman cross, I've been looking for a copy of that for years. There's a picture in the book of a Norman crucifix that Vanauken gave to Lewis. And that, of course, hung in Walter's bedroom.
That's right. Yeah.
For a number of years.
Yeah, I would love to know what's happened to that now.
I asked Walter about it once, and this was towards the end where he was starting to get a little confused. And Walter said, oh, I'm so sorry, I can't give that to you. I've given it to my godson.
Right. That's what I would have expected.
And I wasn't asking for it. I was just asking where it came from. I wanted to get one, like that.
And Vanauken had, that was a copy that he had made for Lewis. And he had one in his home. And I imagine it's still there with Vanauken's godson who lives in Vanauken's former home. So.
Oh, wow. I may have to see if I can track that down. Did he give you a sense of Lewis that doesn't come through necessarily in Lewis's books?
Absolutely.
Tell us something
Definitely.
about that.
Just, well, as you know, when you travel to a certain place that you've read about, like traveling to Oxford, being in the place gives you a feeling that is not necessarily different than what you got from the book, but builds on it and fills it out and associates smells and tastes, and it engages all of the senses. And in the same way, meeting somebody whose book you've just absolutely loved just fills out the picture. And I feel almost apologetic about it now, but when I met Vanauken, I was really more interested in C.S. Lewis than I was I was interested in Vanauken and his story very much so, but most of my questions I realized that I asked him that first time we got together all had to do with C.S. Lewis. And just meeting Van gave me a feel for what I think a little bit of what Lewis would have been like. Even though Van was an American, he was a heavy smoker like C.S. Lewis was. So that would have been similar. His love of literature and the books he had around the room, that would have been similar. He was also not the tidiest person in the world. That would have been similar to Lewis. And he was only 16 years difference in age from Lewis. So there were just a lot of things. And obviously knowing the man, just the whole atmosphere being there with him in his tiny little cottage and looking at his first edition copies of Lewis's books. And I'd pull one off the shelf and open it up, and he would have a review in it from some newspaper in England, from when he first read the book. Or he'd have copies of his letters from Lewis tucked into the pages of Mere Christianity or some of the other books.
Yeah, and didn't you ask him if those are the originals?
I did. I foolishly asked him, "Oh, are those the originals?" And he was horrified. No. I gave the originals to the Bodleian. And
yeah, Malcolm Geit has got one of Malcolm's wife, Maggie's father had been a student of Lewis's and had a letter from him. And so to actually hold one of those in the hands, to kind of...
It's lovely.
And for those of us who loved Lewis, but were never able to meet him, and those who actually knew Lewis and who are still alive, that number's getting smaller.
Yeah, there is something, and maybe this is more true of Lewis than Vanauken. There's something about Lewis's writing style that encourages that personal encounter, or even though Lewis himself called it the personal heresy, that we shouldn't really be interested in the life of the poet. We should be interested in what the poetry is pointing us toward. And it doesn't, in Lewis's mind, it shouldn't point us toward the poet, but something, that the poet is trying to tell us about. Even so, Lewis has this ability, especially in the Narnia Chronicles, where you almost feel like the narrator is your own uncle telling you the story. And so there's something about Lewis's writing style. You get it also in Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. You just feel like you want to meet this man.
And there was, I think, a real generosity of him. I'm sure you've heard Walter tell this story, because Walter had a smallish stock that he told again and again. But he said that Jack told him, when in doubt, give more.
Yeah.
And when he was in doubt about whether or not he should answer the letter, to answer the letter. And I think that some of that generosity seems to have rubbed off on those people who had known Lewis. And
definitely, the more people I've met who knew C.S. Lewis, the one thing that stands out to me about every one of them is that their life was marked by meeting this person indelibly, in a positive way. And that can't always be said of every famous person.
Or even every famous writer. Doug Gresham once said that the thing that the biographers most miss was the persistent sound of laughter in the home, that they were always having this kind of humorous good time. And that wasn't because of a lack of tragedy or because of financial, success. I think that, what does Chesterton say? The reason why angels can fly is because they take themselves so lightly. Right?
I love that.
And I think that Lewis did the same, right? And that seems to have rubbed off.
Absolutely.
I'd like to know a little bit more about the biography. I was especially struck, and I didn't know about this before I read your book, about Davy's daughter. Can you tell us a little bit more about Marion?
Yes. So when I met Vanauken in 1996, I had no intention, no idea of writing a biography about him. Like I said, I was really more interested in his reflections on C.S. Lewis. And it wasn't until years later that the idea sort of came to me, and it came out of my obsession, really. Out of all 14 published books that I have, this book about Vanauken was the result of an obsession. I was obsessed with finding out where Glenn Merrill was. And Vanauken himself had given me the clue. He let me know that he had gone to Wabash College. So then I knew it was in Indianapolis. And he also told me that he had gone to Stanton Military Academy in Virginia. And so years and years later, Vanauken was long gone, and I visited the museum of Stanton Military Academy, which the school no longer exists. And because the school was no longer in existence, they were willing to let me see his student card with his information. And that's how I found out that Glenn Merrill was in Carmel, Indiana, just outside of Indianapolis. And so the whole book came out of that. But the year that I met Vanauken, like I said, I met with him twice. Then he died that fall, and I went to his memorial service at St. Stephen's in Forest, Virginia. And beforehand, a number of his friends gathered in his little home, Van Cott. And among the people there was Davy's daughter. Marion was the name that Davy had given to her. She had had a child out of wedlock when she was 14 years old. Yeah, there's the picture.
Listeners, you can hear the picture from Will's book.
So Davy was born in 1914, as was Van, and so she had this child in 1928. So her daughter, Marion, was the same age as my mother, coincidentally. And we just got on like a house on fire. I gave her a ride to the service at St. Stephen's, and we stayed in touch over the years. And then when it came to I decided out of this obsession about Glenn Merrill to then write a biography of Vanauken because I was finding out so many interesting things. She was very cooperative and provided pictures, and yeah, it was really just amazing. So,
had she had any relationship with her mother at all?
She had not. So the child was given up for adoption, and for many, many years, Marion didn't know anything about her biological parents. And then it was in the 80s when, she had been interested for many years in finding out more and just couldn't. And then through a series of circumstances, a door opened for her. And Vanauken at the same time was interested in finding this daughter that Davy had. And so suddenly Marion finds out that, I'm not sure if she ever found out who her biological father was, but she found out about Davy, and they told her, look, your mother's dead, but the man that she later married would like to meet you. Do you want to pursue it? And she did. And then the person from the adoption agency told her, and this man is an author, and he's written a book all about, this love relationship with your mother, and it's called A Severe Mercy. Well, she went right around to the bookstore. I think she got a hold of that Bantam paperback because that was the only version, I think, that had that picture on the back.
Right.
And that was the first time she saw a picture of her mother. And so out of that, she wrote to Van, and they established a correspondence. Then they eventually met together on a number of occasions and established a very close friendship.
She even ended up calling him father, right?
Yes.
Oh, now, but she had adopted parents, right?
That's right. She'd been adopted actually by a minister and his wife, because Davy's parents, her father was a minister. And so it was kind of a natural connection that way.
And I noticed that you dedicated the book to Marion.
Yes, absolutely. She was just a lovely lady.
Your book is just such a treasure. I mean, I love well-researched things. I love, finding out the background. I think that I would probably, in addition to arguing with Jack about goodbye, I think that maybe it's time to update the argument about personal heresy. I think it's too quick a dismissal.
I would agree.
And our colleague Joel Heck, who has his site joelheck.com and his wonderful, freely accessible Chronologically Lewis, his 1,200-page chronology of every date in Lewis's life. Listeners, you can go to joelheck.com, download this. Joel has read every biography, every diary, every book, scoured the Wade Center, everything he could find. And every date that he can be sure of, he has, and even the dates that he's conjectured, he's put those available in a chronology.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. It seems crazy to some of the people when I tell them about it, but I think that part of the industry around Lewis that helps perpetuate so much of the good that he did is in some ways a combination of biography and obsession. All right. I mean, my own work on finding the original meeting of Joy Davidman, they didn't meet the first time at the Eastgate Hotel. They met a week earlier, at least. And Lewis had her staying at his home in September of 52 before they came to the Eastgate.
Wow.
And Phyllis Williams, there was no such person as Phyllis Williams. It was Michael Williams who came to the Eastgate, or who met them at the Mitre, and I think went along to it. All of this to say, I'm going to do that's part of my work at Northwind in my work on Till We Have Faces, is looking at their initial relationship. And it's this strange thing, which I'm sure that you've experienced, having studied Vanauken and read what he did, and then to actually meet the person. Or when I have contact with Douglas Gresham, it's like, wait, this person I'm obsessing about was not this literary figure. That was your mom, right? That was your mother. But I think that knowing about the biography, especially with Lewis, because he was so consistent, he would say the same thing in a letter and a poem and an essay and a book, all written around the same time, and it would reflect his personal circumstance.
Right. Vanauken was different in that he was more secretive about some things.
What do you think that was about?
I think a number of things. One is that he had a well-known father, at least well-known in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
You know, his father was a politician, a very wealthy lawyer, and his father started the Indiana Broadcasting Company.
Oh, wow.
So I think part of it was he benefited from that,
right.
But he also wanted to be distinct from that, especially when he started writing books. And so that's why I think that's why, I can only guess, but I think that's why he never mentions his parents' names. He even spells his name slightly differently.
Oh, does he really?
You know, instead of Van and then capital Auken, you know, he puts both parts of the name together, you know, just little things like that. And in Severe Mercy, he never mentions his parents' names, which their names were Glenn Vanauken. That was his middle name, and his mother's middle name was Merrill, and that's where Glenn Merrill comes from.
Okay. Oh, I see.
So it was fun just discovering all these little things, you know, that for whatever reason he kind of keeps in the shadows.
Well, and you know, Michael Ward has astutely pointed out Lewis's own secretiveness, and then I've done some subsequent work looking at the way that Lewis is always self-referential, and so I'm now starting to draw a much wider autobiographical arc over Lewis's life, because now I think Till We Have Faces is autobiography, certainly, as McGrath points out. Grief Observed is autobiographical, Surprised by Joy, but then early post. I think Lewis, because he was so secretive, stuff kind of spills out. And it makes for a great detective story, I think.
Yes, exactly.
As a Lewis scholar, to find out things that nobody else knew is not all that hard to do when it comes to that circle. And I'm so glad that you've kind of gotten the shovel in and done all the spade work to fill out this part of Lewis's life in terms of his relationship with Vanauken.
Well, it was great fun.
Well, we're just about out of time, but we just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And as the landlord rings the bell, I'm having trouble. We're trying to find a pub crawl in Oxford of all the Lewis pubs, but so many of them are closing.
Right now, yes. Hopefully they'll come back.
I hear the Lamb and Flag may be opening up again this summer. But so as the landlord rings the final bell for last call, would you let our listeners know where they can go to find out more about you, to pick up a copy of your book, The Man Who Received a Severe Mercy? Also, listeners, I'm getting my eBay shelf up and running again in the new house, and I realize I have not only a copy of the paperback, I have a copy of the hardback, and then I have a copy of Davy's edition,
As do I.
Which you mentioned there are only 10,000. Yeah. Did he give you a copy? Or
No, the first time I saw a copy was the first time I met with Vanauken, because I asked him, did you take any photographs when you were in Oxford? And he said no, that he'd given up photography by that time, but he said there's a book behind you that has some photographs in it. And it was Davy's edition of A Severe Mercy. So my mother and my wife got together and bought me a copy, and I had him sign it the next time I met with them.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I tracked down an extra copy in addition to my own reader's copy, so that'll be going up on the eBay soon. But where can we find all of these marvelous Will Vaus books, especially The Man Who Received a Severe Mercy? So
you can find them all on Amazon, and you can learn about them on my website, willvaus.com. That's WILLVAUS.com. vaus.com.
Wonderful. Well, Will, it's great to renew our friendship. I look forward to the next time our paths cross. Wish that it could be in Oxford, but if it ever is, I won't buy you a gin, but I'd be happy to stand you to a pint. Wherever.
Or how about a glass of sherry?
A glass of, I think that would be perfect. Let's do that. So thanks again to you for taking the time and for coming on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. We also like to thank our Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters. Those include, of course, Marvin, Joelle, Angela, Deborah number 1, Deborah number 2, Amanda, Thomas, Narnia Mouse, Bill and Joanna, Snort and Bud, Shane and John, Kevin, Brian and Kay, Paul, Kimberly, Gillis, Gary, and Stephen, Matt and Kelly, Chris and John, James, Kate, Peter, David, and Rowdy. And if you've enjoyed this episode, we hope that you will share it with a friend. And please join us next time where we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.